For those of you who just may be tuning in, I've been running Concentric as the CEO. My name is Dr. David Heiber. Since 2010, we focus on really conducting home visits, mentoring, and tutoring. We're in 2 primary states, hoping to expand much further. And with our expansion, it's really digging deep into what are the students telling us, what are the families saying that they need, and what are the school systems saying. And I had the pleasure years ago to start doing work in Detroit. And as they always say is, what up, though? And during my time in Detroit, I had the opportunity to meet a couple really good people, but one particular person has stood out, has become a mentor, a big brother, and a friend. Dr. Derrick Coleman is the superintendent of Rouge. He's been there for 10 years now? 11 years now. He's taken a struggling school system and made it thrive. He's increased the enrollment. He's built culture. Every time I go visit there, he's a celebrity, not just with students and staff, but with the community at large. And I just want to welcome you to the set, welcome you to the podcast. I look forward to the honest conversation, the discourse, and the things that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, well, listen, I appreciate the invite. As always, any opportunity that I have to build, especially to talk about this work that we're doing to help move children from poverty to a different socioeconomic class.
Absolutely.
Create healthier children. I couldn't be more honored to be here, so thank you.
No, absolutely. Our pleasure. Tell everybody about you, your journey, because there's this picture of Detroit, and I know I had a picture of Detroit. I have this relationship with Detroit that transcends anything that I can explain. But talk about the Detroit that you knew and you grew up in. I know that on television now they got BMF, and it's just portraying all those things that were happening during the 80s and early 90s. But talk about your journey through Detroit, coming up, and what led you to where you are now.
Yep. So what up, though? That's a Detroit euphemism. But yeah, so I'm from the BMF era of Detroit. You know, I'm 51, and so that is around the same age as those characters are. And Detroit is worse than you've heard, but not as bad as you've heard. So it's a phenomenal place. It was a phenomenal place to grow up in. It had a strong sense of community. It was, in my opinion, with no disrespect to DC, the chocolate city.
Absolutely.
It was what Atlanta once, what Atlanta currently is what Detroit was. It was the home of the black middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Detroit that I grew up in, I'm a child of poverty. And I say that. And the one thing about poverty is that you will never forget how it felt. You can never escape it. You can move to a different income bracket, but you'll never forget your humble beginnings. And so the Detroit that I grew up in, I was born in 1971. I grew up with the sons and daughters of heroin addicts.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was the last generation of people that had grandparents, traditional grandparents. Mm-hmm. We were the first generation of young people who sold drugs. And so the Detroit that I grew up in, if you watch BMF, they talk about other people wanted to be certain type of celebrities in that dope game. They said they wanted to be YBI, which was a Young Boys Incorporated.
Yep.
So we were that first generation of young people who were introduced to the crack era. Mm-hmm. And so what Detroit is now, we're dealing with the remnants of the crack era. And I'll get into that later.
Okay.
But it was a great place to grow up in. Detroit is the home of BMF, Cash Doll. But it was also Big Sean, Derrick Coleman, the basketball player, Steve Smith, Willie Burton. You can name this long line of entertainers and athletes. But it was also the birthplace of Motown music. So we grew up with fashion. It was huge to be from Detroit. There's this culture that Detroit breeds that I wish that I can put into words. You'll know when you met somebody from Detroit because of how we carry ourselves. And I say this with all humility. Mm-hmm. You don't find Detroiters chasing celebrities, because people in Detroit grow up believing they are celebrities.
Yes.
But it's also a place that didn't necessarily push the higher education because you could grow to Detroit, that northern migration, and go work in the factories.
Yes. Yep.
And so that migration from the South to the North was incredible to create that Black middle class, but it also created a city full of people who were highly motivated to work, but lacked a technical skill to move beyond the transition from manufacturing to where we are now.
It's interesting. When I first came to Detroit, my first physical visit to Detroit, it was around 2012. I remember flying into DTW and just overlooking the river and the Renaissance Center and not really knowing what to expect when I drove into Detroit and going into there, and there was snow on the ground, and I'm thinking to myself, there's no way that there's school that's happening, because it was probably like 4 or 5 inches already on the ground and there was still snow coming on the ground. And as I was pulling up to Southeastern High School, I saw students walking, and I said, y'all really have school? And I remember the students saying, like, where are you from? Yeah, like we have school, with a hoodie on. Talk a little bit about, because my experience is when I start doing some work in Detroit around home visits, it was the first city that I encountered where, when I talked about the importance of education and we're knocking on doors saying, you need to come, you need to be able to get this education, provide for yourself or build a future, whatever the case may be, and getting from the parents or maybe even the grandparents, no, you really don't need to. I think they were still kind of stuck in the phase that you didn't need a formal education to be solidly middle class.
Yeah. So children, one, rarely become what they haven't seen. So the exodus of the manufacturing industry, which drove the economy of the state of Michigan, has long caused Detroit to suffer. So if you come up and you're multi-generational, you could go work in the factory and make a decent living. Even when those jobs leave, we are conditioned to believe that higher ed isn't as important. Now, I don't want to mischaracterize Detroit, because there are a ton of people who have come from the city that have gone on to do phenomenal things in education. I just spoke about the Motown era, and you have Diana Ross. Well, Diana Ross's sister is the new dean for Morgan State's College of Medicine.
Oh, really?
Yes. And so there's also been a big push, but Detroit was primarily known as the Motor City because of our dependence on the auto industry. We are the birthplace, of the automobile.
Yeah.
So how do you help people understand that you could take a grasshopper and put it into a small jar and poke holes in it and give everything it needs to survive? Anatomically, the grasshopper has the ability to vertically jump 14 times its height and broad jump 16 times its length. But if it's placed in that jar and it continues to bump its head, conditioning happens. So even when you release that grasshopper after it becomes an adult, it will jump no higher than it was conditioned to believe it could while it lived in that jar.
Okay.
So people aren't taking advantage of it because we don't know what it looks like. If you have not seen the portrait of a graduate, how do you know that graduating from college is possible? Children rarely become what they haven't seen.
Absolutely. So, talk a little bit about to those points that as you're going through in the early 80s and late 80s, as you're going through middle school and high school, you're experiencing BMF, Young Boys Incorporated, and all the things that came with the crack epidemic. Like and growing up in poverty, how did you start thinking about, okay, one, I want to go to college, but two, start thinking about, okay, not only do I want to go to college, I want to get into education. Like what led you on that journey? So
the reason why I became a teacher was because the community that I came from, I grew up with the sons and daughters of heroin addicts. It's ironic that we're in Baltimore because I watched The Wire, which is one of my favorite shows of all time, and it talked about the heroin era.
Yes.
And its impact on Baltimore. So I knew that, in hindsight, our teachers knew, based on our zip codes, the socioeconomic backgrounds that we all came from. So if we're coming from the sons and daughters of heroin addicts, there aren't fathers in our home, how is the school not more supportive or inviting to our situations?
Okay.
So I simply became a teacher because I lost really good friends, whether it be through the drug trade. They were incarcerated. They were murdered. Some became addicted to, because that generation just before me, we watched them disappear. So I just felt like a school was the only place we all entered that gave us a fair chance. But I didn't start college till I was 20.
Okay.
Made the exact same mistakes that many of the guys that I grew up with made. I just didn't have to pay for those mistakes. So you find yourself in this space where you have to make a decision. What is it that I desire to do? Because I know staying on this path is going to lead me to an early demise. So I didn't go to college it wasn't calculated. I went to college because I felt like there wasn't anything else for me to do. Yet I was an honor student. So the school also, it spends so much time addressing adverse and negative behavior that you forget about those kids that simply needed somebody to say, hey, come this way. Because if my mother didn't graduate from high school, how can she help me understand how to fill out FAFSA? How can she get me on a college tour? And it just didn't happen. So I ended up in education because it's my purpose in life is to make life better for young people.
Did you know that in undergrad? Because when I was in undergrad, I thought, and we share similar backgrounds, is that I didn't start undergrad right after high school. And I thought I wanted to be an attorney. And then situations didn't work out that way. And I kind of fell into education as like a second choice. Was going into education your first choice?
Yes and no. So I majored in education because I said if money didn't matter, I wanted to be a teacher. Because again, everything that I just said, my friends and I needed somebody to understand our conditions, to say, hey, here's the path that you should take. But I didn't want to live off of a teacher's salary.
Absolutely.
So I said,
especially back then, right?
Yeah. So I said, well, you know what? I'll go to law school and then I'll retire from, being an attorney and then go teach. And when I did my student teaching helped me understand my purpose. And if money didn't matter, and I saw myself and my friends and these kids, that at the end of the day, you can't take any of that with you. So I said that I'm not going to judge wealth by how much money I have, but the return on my investment in young people. So
it doesn't happen too frequently now as much. But I remember I actually did student teaching, which doesn't happen as frequently now. So take me through, you do your student teaching, you graduate. Take me through that first year of teaching. I think a lot of people would like to know, like, what are some of the things that you went to Detroit, you're from Detroit, graduated from Detroit. Was your first teaching job back in Detroit?
Yes. So my first teaching job, I actually went back and taught at my alma mater, Western International High School.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But I didn't get a permanent position because I came mid-year.
Okay.
So I subbed for a semester, and then Detroit Central High School had a vacancy. And initially I was like, man, I'm not going to Central. I just talked to you about Young Boys Incorporated. That Linwood Dexter area was literally where everything happened. You knew what was going to happen when you got over there to Central. But that was me thinking as a younger person. As an adult, I said, man, I'm going over to Central. Greatest thing that ever happened to me, because it was the most adverse conditions that I can be in. And I found great success there. Confidence is the single greatest, for me, outside of your preparation. Confidence will dictate how successful you'll be in life. I walked into that environment and was able to galvanize this energy between that young group of students who I had and myself. Never had to write a referral. Never was met with disrespect, because I understood that the energy that I put out, I reap. And so having success there gave me this, if I can be successful with this population, I can do anything. So the greatest thing I ever did was going back to teach in Detroit.
Absolutely. So how long were you actually a classroom teacher?
Officially 3 years.
So technically, you were you were fast tracked. You were identified. So share with us how you start thinking, going through that process, being a teacher, and then identifying, well, yeah, maybe administration might be something.
Yeah. So I didn't necessarily think about administration initially. I just wanted to be a phenomenal teacher. So I joined, and I talked to my teachers now about teacher leadership opportunities. And people are constantly trying to figure out, how do you make more money? The money will come if you become an expert in what you do. How do you become a high performer? So all I wanted to do was be a great teacher. And I understood that I needed to sit on these different committees. I needed to attend the extracurricular events of young people. So all of those things that I wanted to see my teachers do, I did. And as a result of that, I was recognized and then fast-tracked for simply walking in purpose. And so I talk to people all the time about this work, right? And they'd be like, oh, I'm passionate. I love young people. Passion is an emotion. It is a deep emotion. It's fleeting. I can be in love with you today, right? But then once you and I have a falling out, that love oftentimes can become hate. I can become dismissive. I don't care about you anymore. But if you walk in purpose, it doesn't matter what happens. Every day you get up with the understanding that I'm here to do this work, whether it be God's work. If I'm saying that the universe pushed me here, whatever that reason, I walk in purpose. And so for me, this work just, my spirit, it resonates well with my spirit. So I know I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
I remember my first opportunity. So I was a teacher only for 1 year. And I thought as a teacher, automatically, because I didn't inquire, that you got paid 12 months a year.
Right.
And then, so as the year was winding down, some of my colleagues were saying, okay, so what are you going to do for the next 2 months? I said, well, I'm just going to sit back and collect paychecks for the next 2 months because I'm getting paid. They were like, well, no, we don't get paid 12 months a year. So what are you going to do? And that is when I start working at a group home. And then I got a phone call to teach summer school with someone I'm even close with now, 22 years ago, to teach English for 12th grade. When I come back that second year, I was going to teach social studies. That was my content. And one of our assistant principals was not going to come back. They were on some like long-term leave or something like that. And one of the older assistant principals, this is when, you were lifelong educators. They had been in education longer than I had been alive. And they said, look, next person up, we heard that you were pretty good with students. Here's a walkie-talkie. You're assistant principal. We're worried about getting it to the board later on. And I was just given a walkie-talkie. So you explained your first year journey, or your couple years as a teacher. How about that first year with a walkie-talkie as an assistant principal? How was that? And where was it?
So I think that I've had just this very unique experience in education, right? Because again, people are constantly trying to figure out what were they born to do and why are we here? So I found out early in my professional career what I should be doing. So I haven't really been met with a lot of resistance. It wasn't difficult because I was there for the right reason. So if I understood sacrifice, if you know that we're dealing with kids who don't have a ton of parental support or people that are there to support them, going to these events is mutually beneficial.
Absolutely.
You're there for work, but they get to see that you care. Once they see that you care, it's easier to deal with young people. The people who you're responsible for supervising, adults are nothing but grown children. So when I looked at the people I was responsible for, my job was to figure out, how do I make them better? And I needed to understand what their deficits were, their areas of growth, and their strengths, so that I'm giving them something that they need. So because I've always operated from with a high level of empathy, I recognized that by seeing things through another person's perspective, I can help them get better. So I help children get better. I help the adults get better, or was at least committed to it. So the work didn't necessarily feel like work. And then I've always been a 12-month employee.
Okay.
But the reason for it is because I worked summer school, extra pay, everything that I could do, because I didn't want to live off a teacher's salary.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I had 3 jobs. All of that was conditioning for this work that I'm getting ready to do now. So when people say, hey, what do you do during the summer? I work harder than I do during the regular year.
Absolutely. So now you've gone, you're a teacher, been an AP. Talk to us about that first assignment as a principal. Like how was that, and what was it? What you thought it would be? More so, less so? Like tell me about that first year.
Yep. So great question. So I became a principal at 30 at Pontiac Central High School. And in my 26 and a half year career, all but 2 of them have been in high poverty communities. Pontiac is a phenomenal, city in Oakland County,
Yes.
which is just north of Detroit. But it is a lower income, struggling community in the midst of affluence. So you have Bloomfield Hills, West Bloomfield, Rochester,
Auburn Hills, right?
Auburn Hills.
Yep.
Oakland County was the 3rd richest county in the country for probably 30 years. So I lift that to say, and I go into the poorest city in the county. But I wasn't prepared for it initially because I went there to be an assistant principal.
Okay.
The principal started having health issues, so a month in, I'm the interim principal.
Yes.
At 30. But that crisis, I found opportunity. And I talk often about there's opportunity in crisis. I didn't have a safety net. I could not fail. So I invested so much into my personal growth around leadership that I had to find a mentor, but there was no mentor present. So I found my mentor in books. So I spent so much time learning about what it took to be a leader that I'm walking in purpose, I'm prepared, and all of that allowed me to have success because I recognized that if I'm not successful here as a Black male, I may not get another job.
Absolutely. So talk about that. So now you're at Pontiac Central. What's the journey back to Detroit?
So I stayed at Pontiac Central for 4 years, and I talked to people about, I was in love with Pontiac. That was passion. And at some point, you reach a point where relationships have run its course. I then leave there and go work in an affluent community in Washington County. So I worked in 3 different counties in the southeastern Michigan area. Stayed there for 2 years and had phenomenal assessment data and culture and climate, where we were able to reduce suspensions and expulsions. And in every category that was assessed on the state assessment, we had double-digit gains.
Oh, okay.
That got me the assistant superintendent's position in Detroit. But here's the irony in it. That wasn't my best work. My best work had occurred in Pontiac. But the achievement data in Pontiac wasn't what the achievement data was, in Lincoln.
Okay.
Because of the socioeconomics. But I did better work in Pontiac than I did Lincoln.
Okay.
But it was Lincoln's data and the collective of my resume that got me into Detroit as an assistant superintendent. I got there at 35. So it was impossible for somebody outside of the system to come back into Detroit. I had no birthright. I had no network, no political affiliations that could get me there. I walk in purpose. I'm prepared. With performance, I end up back in Detroit. And I'm choosing now between Detroit as an assistant superintendent or going to Pittsburgh as the director of secondary education. And I remember talking to the superintendent, he was the CEO in Pittsburgh, and he asked me, why would I want to go to Detroit? And then I asked him, if I'm being drafted and I can choose between going to the Steelers or to the Lions, where would I want to go? Was the question. And he said, to the Steelers. And I said, no, I want to go to Detroit because I'm a Detroiter and I want to resurrect the hometown franchise. So I chose Detroit because I thought that it gave me the best opportunity to do my best work.
So growing up in Detroit, going to high school in Detroit, going to college, between being a teacher in Detroit, then going to your different stops, and then coming back to Detroit as assistant sup. Give us some context about how much had Detroit changed, that where you were seeing it every single day, not just living there, but actually experiencing it with the students from the time that you were growing up to the time you were assistant student? Was there any type of noticeable change?
Oh, absolutely. The city had changed. So now we're talking, I graduated from high school in 1989. This is 2008. And by 2008, the state of Michigan may have lost, we were losing, I think, 20,000 manufacturing jobs a year for almost a 10-year period. So the economic climate in Michigan was everything we operated from a deficit. So what happens when you're dealing with poverty and all of the collateral consequences of poverty? So schools were closing in Detroit because of declining enrollment.
Yes.
Families aren't employed. It is difficult to find employment because, again, we're not skilled enough for the technical jobs that have come to Detroit. But people want to be able to have success. So you walk back into the city, the district had a $34 million deficit.
Yeah, yes. I mean,
Excuse me. It was difficult. The district had, when you talk about education, and I am a teacher at heart, teachers are blamed for all of the ills in society and very rarely credited for their good deeds or good work.
absolutely.
So you walk back into a space and they had been asked to give concessions. So they're working in the most adverse conditions in the city, in the state. They're asked to give back money, cuts, class size, all of the dilapidated and crumbling infrastructure. It was a tough place to work. And so as a leader, one thing I'm not going to do is make false promises. Nor can you change those conditions overnight. So my job was simple. How do you provide chicken soup for the administrative soul? How do I help those building principals and administrators and teachers feel better about the work, help them understand that I recognize what their challenges are? We can't fix this, but here's what we can do. We can make a commitment to come here every day and give these children the very best that we have. And that's what I had to help people do, because when you're dealing with trauma in the workplace, along with those things that we have dealt with at our own homes, we're not always bringing that best person to stand in front of children who, because of their lives, it's not always easy to love them. So we had to convince adults to love children, even when the children may have not made it easy to do so. And that was the focus of my work, because I couldn't fix buildings. The money to fix those deficits weren't just going to be provided to the district, but what I could work on is culture and touch the hearts of people to do right by children.
It's interesting when I go back to when I first came to Detroit, and people ask me what were some of my initial impressions. The grit, the resiliency, this feeling that if you committed yourself and you had hard work, you could overcome. But when they asked me to describe it physically, to me it was post-Katrina New Orleans without the natural disaster.
There was a YouTube segment devoted to Detroit called Ruined Porn, where they literally were going through Detroit, just taking videos of how the city had began to decay, and blocks that once stood where now you could see from the end of one block to the other. But all of that was a collateral consequence of the war on drugs and the drug trade. The city that I grew up in was beautiful. Even though I may have grown up in a poor part of it, you can go just blocks away in other parts of the city and you're like, man, Detroit is beautiful. When you deal with addiction and crime, those who have the ability to leave.
Yeah.
Those who remain are either diehards, which is a small percentage, or people who can't. When they're in survival mode, we're not always conscious of the actions and things that we're doing and the negative effect that it's going to have on us long term. So an addict isn't thinking about, by me stealing the basketball rims or going into these homes and taking the copper plumbing, that they're going to eventually have to tear this house down. They're feeding a disease.
Yes. Yeah.
When young people are predatory and robbing other people or breaking in cars, they need to eat. So the city that I grew up in to the city that I ended up working in were vastly different. And you're asking young people to now raise themselves because those fathers are no longer in the home because of incarceration. Those that were there, their jobs were a lot more difficult. So it's difficult to describe Detroit to somebody who hadn't been there, because you can be in this part of the city, which is absolutely beautiful, and then you're 3 blocks from hell every place you're in Detroit. So you have pockets of just beauty surrounded by devastation.
Yeah, it's. I remember. Again, I was thinking about. My work had grown in Detroit, taking multiple schools, and I was thinking about purchasing a home there instead of hotels or just renting. And I was saying at that point I was going to be there once every other week. And the realtor who was showing me said, "Well, unless you have someone living there, they're gonna peep you out, and when you're gonna come back, you're not gonna have pipes left." So it was almost coaching me out of purchasing home in Detroit. So now you go through being an assistant sup. Talk to us about the journey to being a superintendent, and then how you grew into being Dr. Derrick Coleman now, that I've met as a transformational superintendent. And at your core, and I know you'll get to it, one of the unique things about your district, it doesn't have metal detectors.
Correct.
Like, tell me about that journey from there, assistant sup, to now.
Yeah. So me being a transformational superintendent had nothing to do with me and my desire to necessarily have that title. It was, how do you create conditions for children from poverty to have access to opportunity that they would not have had otherwise? The system of education as we know it is an institution. And so the institution is designed to produce exactly what it's created for.
Yes.
So if you can look, whether you're in Detroit, Baltimore, Chicago, Atlanta, any large metropolis that has people of color that are low income, you're going to see the same things. It's by design. So I just simply said that I'm going to be radical in my approach to address student behavior by addressing their health. And the health isn't just their physical health, but it's their mental health. You can't place multiple generations of people in poverty and deal with those war-torn conditions and believe that they're going to be normal when schools are created off of a middle-class set of values and beliefs. I believe that you create a system that meets every child where they are by being flexible to say, here's the expectation for your behavior, here's the support that we're going to provide, and you have to acknowledge the traumatic experiences that these young people have had. Whether it's a single event, an incident where there may have been a young person may have been touched inappropriately, or just not to be politically correct, but they were molested as children.
Yeah.
Even if it happened one time, that can affect them forever.
Yeah, absolutely.
To people who are dealing with household dysfunction, an addict in the home, community violence, all of those things, that shapes who that child becomes. And then we expect them, through no fault of their own, to now walk into a school and leave all of that baggage when they walk through metal detectors. Metal detectors aren't transformational. They actually create a false sense of safety, because for every criminal that you know, they find their way around whatever systems you've tried to implement to address that behavior. Yeah. Criminals get smarter. So I said, you don't add metal detectors to school. You add social workers, you add therapists. You create a platform that is founded around addressing that childhood trauma, that unresolved debt that they have, because the healthier the child, the better they'll perform. The reason why you don't see a lot of rioting or people in upper income communities tearing their neighborhoods up, they're healthier.
Yes, absolutely.
And so healthy people don't do what we see. So how do you create a healthy child? By acknowledging all of those things that I just spoke of, committing to it, and knowing it's not easy work. I don't want to dominate the conversation. I just want to say that people think that, okay, you're going to do these things and you're not going to see any of those behaviors anymore. If you get a student in 9th grade and they graduate in 12th grade, that's a 4-year cycle.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get a new 9th grader that may be dealing with far worse things, or some that may not be dealing with any of that who still need that attention. So create a system that just simply says that I see you, David Heiber.
Mm-hmm.
You matter, and we're going to figure out how to make you successful, whether you're having any problems or not, there's academic deficits, or you're a high-performing student. You have the right to come here, and we're going to commit ourselves to making sure that you'll do great things.
Yeah, no, I think what you did by not having metal detectors, it was revolutionary and it went against the common norm.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The other thing that I was completely impressed by is if you could speak briefly about the dogs.
Yes.
That you have in one of your in your schools.
Yep. So we have an animal-assisted intervention program.
Okay.
So while we have therapy dogs, we have 6 dogs in the district.
Okay.
With one being a dog that helps students with reading. It's a reading buddy. If you look at the research on having animals in a space, if you look at veterans who come back from war and other people who have therapy dogs, they're all dealing with some form of trauma. Children are dealing with trauma. So we created an animal-assisted intervention program because sometimes that child won't trust an adult or a human, but it'll trust an animal. So it gives us an opportunity to help soothe and calm them, looking at what the science says. But we also have a teacher's pet program. So in some classrooms, we might have hamsters, there are rabbits, butterflies, like you name it. Each classroom has a different animal because we want to try to do whatever we can to help emotionally regulate young people who may come to us, in that state. So in addition to the Animal Assisted Intervention Program, which is ran by Keisha Alexander, she is the country's only Black veterinary social worker.
Oh, wow.
Now, here's something that's crazy. When initially I met her and I was like, what's a veterinary social worker? Like, I didn't know animals needed a social worker. But she uses animals to help in the process of dealing with, again, any of those emotional issues that young people may have.
No, I just think that one of the things that I'm very impressed by is just your constant push to do things differently and try things out of the box, but not being random about it, being very targeted and intentional about it. After I saw the animal assistant in your schools, I didn't think about it. I didn't think through it, but I impulsively bought a dog for the office, and the dog lasted a day.
Right.
Because I didn't think it through. But as you continue to do that, what do you think is the next phase, the next iteration of Derrick Coleman? Where do you see it going?
So I want to make sure that as a system we perfect all of the protocols and everything that is required within that system, the mechanics of it. Because again, you're dealing with highly volatile people, adults and children, the economy, that we find ourselves in. Man, we're paying $7 for a dozen eggs.
Yes.
So when you look at inflation, you look at post-COVID, the mental health of everybody that I've been around has been compromised. So I want to make sure that I am the preeminent expert in providing these solutions to schools.
Okay.
From then on, how do you replicate this in other areas? It's not exclusive to poverty, but most definitely children who are coming from, impoverished communities need these services far more than others, because more affluent parents have the ability through their insurance or through access to take that child to go get some help. We'll tell children to suck it up or ain't nothing wrong with you, which is furthest from the truth, And so when you ask people to now cope without having coping mechanisms, it is a recipe for a disaster, because it's like a soda. And what happens when you shake a soda up?
Explodes.
It explodes.
Yep.
So I want to just perfect my craft. I do work right now with other school districts and organizations around creating trauma-informed and healing organizations, because we talk about trauma a lot, but I want to focus on the healing aspect of it, because sometimes we look at trauma and get stuck there.
Absolutely.
Because people talk about, this is what happened to me. We want to acknowledge what happened to you, but now the solution becomes, how do we help you heal from that, with the understanding that you're never healed, but in a perpetual state of healing.
No, I think that's amazing and phenomenal in that approach and the next step. If you could give just a couple words of advice or wisdom to aspiring superintendents, particularly Black males, what would that be?
That every job isn't going to be a good job. And I've heard people often say that as Black superintendents, we only get those districts that are struggling, right? And that may be the case, but I'd rather go where I'm wanted than try to force myself into a space that may not appreciate the uniqueness of my experience and my leadership. So find a place that's a good fit for you, that's not asking you to compromise who you are at your core. But before you can compromise who you are at your core, establish who you are. Because I've watched people, Will Smith talked about, we're all actors who have developed these characters that have allowed us to successfully migrate or, make it throughout life. Like, you can't take a character into these spaces because you're going to be challenged.
Absolutely.
So ask yourself if you're committed to what it is going to require, and then find a place that best fits you. Because the life expectancy of the urban superintendent, the Black male, is 2 years or less. I'm on year 11 with 4 additional years on my current contract.
Okay.
But that's because I chose a space that was right for me. And when other districts came to recruit me, regardless to how she looks to somebody else, I'm in love with her because she's good for me and I'm good for her. So don't become seduced by the bigger districts. Don't become seduced by the sexier districts. Find somebody who's a great fit for you, and that'll give you your best opportunity for success.
Absolutely. Very salient points. Thank you for visiting the set. It's the first time, won't be the last time. One door at a time, our podcast for Concentric Educational Solutions. My name is David Heiber, the host and CEO and founder of Concentric. I want to thank you, Derrick, for joining. Your words of advice and just sage wisdom for us to follow. Look for us for the next episode, and we appreciate you tuning in, and thank you.
Thank you.
And as always, go to concentric.world to view the podcast and all of our media, social media, and just a place where we share our content. Peace.